Have you ever made a decision in a leadership meeting, knew it was the right call, and still spent the entire night replaying it in your head? You're lying in bed at 2 o'clock in the morning, running through every word you said, every strategic point made, wondering if you should have explained your rationale differently. Or have you ever sent an important recommendation to senior leadership, closed your laptop, and immediately started second guessing whether you positioned it clearly enough? How about this? Have you ever led your team through a difficult situation successfully and still found yourself mentally reviewing whether you should have handled the decision better? Welcome to Brains and Baubles Live. I'm Davina Dandridge, and today we're addressing something you might not have language for yet: the gap between making sound leadership decisions and finding emotional peace after you make them. You're confident in your work. Your team trusts your judgment. Your colleagues respect your decision making. You've been leading at this level for years. But there's this quiet restlessness that shows up after significant decisions. And it's not because you made a wrong call, it's because you can't stop reviewing whether it was perfect enough. I lived in that gap. And I created a method that helps you move from anxious replay to emotional peace, a process that helps you close the loop on leadership decisions so you can actually rest. If you're a director, senior professional, or founder carrying the weight of constant mental review, replaying decisions, preparing for criticism that hasn't even happened yet, running through scenarios where someone questions your strategic judgment, then this episode will show you a different way. So let's get started. Protecting your emotional capacity as a leader means learning which decisions deserve continued mental energy and which ones need to be closed. Here's what you need to understand about what's actually happening. You're not replaying the decision because it was wrong. You're replaying it because you're anxious about how it will be received by leadership or your board or stakeholders. And that anxiety doesn't live in your reality, it lives in your imagination. You're lying there, forecasting criticism that hasn't even happened yet. You're preparing answers to questions that no one has even asked you, running through scenarios where someone challenges your thinking, even though no one has. The restlessness you feel isn't about the decision itself. That's anxiety about being watched while you make high stake decisions. And there is a difference. You made a thoughtful call with the information you had, but your mind won't let you close the file because you're operating from perfectionism. You keep asking yourself, what if I should have known more? What if I missed something? What if they think that I was unprepared? Here's what's actually at stake. That pattern isn't just stealing your sleep, it's impacting your leadership effectiveness because your emotions impact your thinking impacts your behavior, and your behavior determines whether you develop confidence in your strategic judgment or stay trapped in cycles of anxiety. When you lie there replaying that board meeting, you're feeling anxiety. That anxiety is telling you that you're not safe, that you need to prepare for an attack, that you have to defend yourself. And that emotion shapes how you think. You start thinking, I should have said that differently, or I need to explain myself better, or I have to make sure that they understand my rationale. Those thoughts then drive your behavior to the next leadership context. You over explain in the next meeting. You preemptively defend choices no one has questioned. You start editing yourself before you speak because you're trying to avoid the criticism you imagined last night. And that behavior doesn't build your authority, it undermines it. Because every time you operate from anxiety, you're reinforcing the belief that you can't trust your own judgment. You're retraining yourself to second guess your strategic decisions, and over time, that becomes how you show up as a leader. Not because you're not capable, it's because you've been reinforcing anxiety instead of emotional peace. Let me tell you something most women in leadership don't learn until much later. And both of these are true. Your future as a leader is built by the decisions you make. And your future as a leader is built by how you respond after you make decisions. If you respond with anxiety, going over it again and again, second guessing yourself, you're building a future self who's constantly questioning her own strategic judgment. But if you respond with emotional peace, trust, and forward movement, you're building a future self who's confident, composed, and capable of leading without exhausting herself. And let me show you what I mean with a story from my own leadership journey. Years ago, I made a strategic decision that looked like failure to anyone watching. I was building my business and investing everything into a vision that required me to reallocate my resources. I drove an old van to work while I was pouring money into building something that wasn't visible yet to anybody else. And I felt the judgment. Every time I pulled into that parking lot, I felt it. The assumptions that people were making about my choices, the recalculations about my credibility as someone who could lead and build something significant. Everything in me wanted to explain, to make people understand that I wasn't regressing. It was a strategic investment in my future authority and influence. I'd lie there at night replaying those moments, wondering if I should have explained myself differently, preparing justifications for questions that no one is actually asking me. That internal question kept showing up. Is it worth it? But here's what I had to learn. The judgment hurt, and replaying those parking lot moments in my mind wasn't solving anything. It was feeding the anxiety I was trying to manage. I could either spend my emotional capacity defending my decision to people who couldn't see what I was building, or I could live inside that decision with emotional peace and let my results speak when the timing is right. I chose emotional peace. And I had to learn to recognize when I was processing strategically versus when I was feeding fear. That's what you need to master, the ability to recognize when you're solving a problem versus when you're replaying for no productive reason. Let me walk you through what you're managing when decision anxiety activates. When you replay decisions anxiously, you're not solving problems, you're feeding fear. Your brain thinks it's protecting you by reviewing everything. But what it's actually doing is reinforcing the belief that you can't trust your own strategic judgment. Every replay session trains your nervous system to treat your leadership decisions as threats. And over time, that becomes your default emotional state as a leader. This pattern has consequences beyond lost sleep. It affects your presence in meetings because you're managing past conversations instead of engaging with current strategic decisions. It affects your decision making speed because you're trying to predict every possible outcome before committing. It affects how your team perceives your confidence because people feel your anxiety even when you think you're managing it well. It isn't about being weak. This is about understanding that unprocessed anxiety compounds until it affects your leadership effectiveness. Emotional peace doesn't mean you never have doubts. It means you don't let those doubts control you after the decision is made. Emotional peace means you made a thoughtful call, you trust your judgment, and you'll handle whatever feedback comes from leadership or stakeholders. Emotional peace means if there are gaps in the decision, you'll close them. If it didn't work as planned, you'll pivot. If you made a mistake, you'll learn and adjust. But you can't do any of that from a place of anxious replay at 2 a.m. in the morning. You solved problems with strategic thinking during the day, not panic in the middle of the night. You cannot process every imagined criticism. You can't prepare for every reaction. And you definitely can't explain yourself to everyone who might misunderstand your leadership decision. Some people are operating from limited understanding. They can't see what you're building because they are not invested in your outcome. You must set boundaries, though, and you set them around your mental energy. And those boundaries are for you, they're not for them. The boundaries protect your emotional capacity so you can focus on what actually matters, leading effectively. So here's what creates the kind of emotional peace that lets you make leadership decisions and actually rest afterward. A process that helps you close the loop on decisions so you can move forward instead of staying stuck in review mode. It's called the self gut check method. The self gut check method helps you recognize when you're processing strategically versus when you're feeding anxiety. When you find yourself lying there at 2 a.m. in the morning replaying the board meeting, you pause, you breathe, and you name what's happening. I'm feeling anxious about how this decision will be received. Then you ask yourself three questions. Is this true? Is this helpful? And is this timely? Is it true that you made a bad decision? Or are you imagining judgment that hasn't happened? Is it helpful to replay this conversation when nothing can be changed right now? Is this timely? Or are you reviewing something that's already in motion and outside of your control at this moment? Most of the time, the answer is no. You're not solving a problem, you're feeding anxiety. And once you recognize that, you can make a different choice. You can choose emotional peace. That's what I learned during the van season. When I'd lie there replaying those parking lot moments, preparing explanations for people who hadn't even asked, the self gut check helped me recognize what was actually happening. I wasn't solving a problem, I was managing imagined judgment. And that wasn't serving where I was building my authority and influence. The self gut check method is what separates anxious replay from strategic reflection. One keeps you stuck, the other moves you forward as a leader. Let me show you how this works with decision anxiety in leadership context. You made a call in a board meeting. Hours later, you're still thinking about it. Your mind's running through alternative approaches, wondering if you positioned it clearly enough. The old pattern, you lie there replaying every word. You're mentally preparing defenses for criticism that hasn't come. You wake up tomorrow already exhausted from managing imagined feedback, which affects your presence in the next leadership meeting. The self gut check pattern, you pause 5 seconds. You ask yourself, is this anxiety about the decision itself, or is this anxiety about being judged? If it's about the decision, you can address it. You schedule time tomorrow to review it strategically. You identify what additional information you need. You determine your next steps. If it's about being judged, you recognize that you can't control other people's reactions. You made the best call you could with the information you had. You'll handle feedback when it comes. Right now, you need to rest so you can lead effectively tomorrow. This is the difference between anxious replay and strategic thinking. You can't solve problems from anxiety at 2 a.m. in the morning. You solve them with strategic thinking during the day. The self gut check helps you know the difference. Here's another example. You sent an important recommendation to senior leadership. Now you're second guessing whether you explained your rationale clearly enough. The old pattern, you mentally draft follow up explanations. You prepare additional justifications. You imagine questions they might have and you rehearse your answers. This eats your mental capacity for other strategic priorities. The self gut check pattern, you pause. You ask, did I communicate what needed to be communicated? Or am I trying to preemptively defend against imagined criticism? If there's genuinely something unclear, you can clarify it tomorrow with a brief follow up. If you're just managing anxiety, you recognize that over explaining doesn't build your credibility, it undermines it. You made your recommendation, you provided your rationale. Now let it stand and focus on your next leadership priority. Over explaining doesn't make you more credible as a leader. It makes you look like you don't trust your own judgment. The self gut check protects you from that. The self gut check gives you this discernment in real time. You can use it in the moment anxiety starts to build up. Proverbs 3 5 through 6 says, Trust in the Lord with all thine heart, and lean not unto thine own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct thy paths. This isn't spiritual advice. This is strategic wisdom for leaders. You made the decision with discernment. You weighed the option. You consulted the right people. You prayed about it. Now, just trust the outcome will unfold as it should. Because constantly re examining your choices doesn't improve them, it just keeps you trapped in self doubt. The peace that passes understanding isn't the absence of challenge, it's the presence of trust. It's knowing that even if someone questions your decisions, you can handle it. Even if the outcome isn't what you expected, you'll adjust. Even if you made a mistake, you'll learn and move forward. That kind of emotional peace doesn't come from getting everything right. It comes from knowing that you can handle whatever comes next as a leader. Emotional peace isn't the absence of challenge, it's the confidence that you can handle whatever feedback comes without it destabilizing your leadership. When you develop this level of emotional sophistication as a leader, something shifts in how you operate. You stop replaying conversations that are already done. You start closing the loop on decisions so you can move forward with clarity and focus on your next strategic priority. You create space for the strategic thinking that actually move things forward instead of exhausting yourself with anxious review. The leader you want to be doesn't lie awake at night second guessing every call she makes. She makes thoughtful decisions, trusts her judgment, and handles feedback with composure when it comes. She doesn't need constant validation to know she's making sound strategic calls. The future version of yourself, she's developed emotional peace as a way of operating. She uses the self gut check method automatically. She recognizes when she's processing strategically versus feeding anxiety. She chooses emotional peace over panic. And that creates specific outcomes in your leadership. Your team sees you as composed and confident because you're not managing internal anxiety while trying to lead externally. Your decision making speed improves because you're not trying to predict every possible reaction before committing. Your sleep improves because you've trained yourself to close the loop on decisions instead of replaying them endlessly. Your authority strengthens because you're operating from confidence rather than defending anxiety. This is what emotional sophistication looks like in leadership. You're not just managing your anxiety, you're using emotional precision to build the kind of emotional peace that sustains your effectiveness and your influence. Emotional sophistication means you make decisions and let them stand. That's what protects your emotions while advancing your authority. Now, let me address something practical for leaders. You need a place to process decision anxiety without appearing indecisive to your team or to leadership. You need to work through what's strategic concern versus what's anxious replay. That's why I created SOPHI, my emotional strategy AI. SOPHI isn't therapy. She's strategic guidance for the emotional work that comes with leadership at this level. You can process decision anxiety privately. You can work through the self gut check method with her support. You can determine what needs strategic follow up versus what needs to be released. She's available whenever you need her. No scheduling, no explanations, no risk to your professional image. Think of SOPHI as your private strategist for developing emotional peace that lets you make decisions and actually rest afterward. Now you have the self gut check method. Here's an implementation step. Tonight, before you go to bed, think about 3 recent leadership decisions you made that worked out well. They don't have to be major. They can be strategic calls that you trusted that turned out fine. Acknowledge them. Let them remind you that you've been making good decisions all along. Tomorrow morning, when you do your gratitude routine, include something you're grateful for about your leadership capability. I'm grateful for the wisdom to make a call. That's how you start building emotional peace. Thank you for being here today on Brains and Baubles Live. If you're ready to develop this kind of emotional peace in your leadership, start with the Emotional Sophistication Map. It shows you where your emotional system is serving your decision making and where anxiety is undermining your confidence. Take it at my website, davinadandridge.com. From there, you can explore the Self-Gut Check course for implementing this method in decision making, feedback management, and developing emotional peace. And SOPHI gives you the private support for processing decision making and developing strategic responses. Your potential as a leader is limitless. Your capacity for peaceful, confident leadership is just beginning to be fully expressed. See you next time.